Simon, it's great to welcome you from Dubai. And you've been setting the bar high, playing tennis at about 4 in the morning. But I gather the weather is a little cooler at that time.
Well, I can tell you that the humidity on Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock on the tennis court was 83, and there wasn't a breath of air.
Now, your thought for the day is Middle East, more thoughts. And we have to preface this discussion by saying things are horrific, and that being said, hone in on what is going on from the beginning, which we started to hear about on Saturday morning. What is your take?
Well, I think, first of all, let's preface everything that I'm going to say with something that I think is very fundamental. And that is that certainly Israel and America have forgotten how to use diplomacy, and instead they use just threats and force. So with that, what one can say is that without diplomacy, there cannot be peace. And without peace, all that is left is war. Wars need money and liquidity, and wars draw global funds into the perceived safe haven of America. And this is what has occurred. And I just wonder whether this is an ongoing ploy by America in order to finance its growing budget deficits and its debt. So against that, where do we start? I think the interesting point is some strategists believe that there was the Mossad and the other intelligence agencies deliberately turned a blind eye from what they knew was coming. So the question you have to ask is why? Was it to allow a catastrophe to occur that would unite a divided society? Or was it a ruse to bring down the country's prime minister? Or was it a wider plan involving the CIA to widen the war that would then bring in another front to the war with Russia? So I think that's where we should be starting, because what one now is seeing, that the northern front is opening up with Hezbollah, which is going to make life very difficult for Israel. And in fact, I had a message today saying that the US Army 101 1st Airborne Division is pulling out of Romania and being transferred to Jordan. So a northern front has several implications. My sources suggest that Israel will probably attack Damascus. If that is the case, that will bring Russia in, as they are supportive of Assad and Syria. So this would, as the intelligence agencies are speculating, create a new front of the war between Russia and America. Will it then force Putin to deploy troops and equipment from the Ukrainian war to the new war in Syria? That's quite possible. What is interesting is that all the Arab countries, plus China and Russia, have said the only solution is the creation of an independent Palestine state. Well, of course, if that happens, it creates huge problems for Israel. And Israel's long-term objective has always been to have continuous borders from the south to the north. Now, is that going to be allowed to happen? Can a peaceful arrangement be made? Certainly not without the conflict intensifying. And I think this is really what the Arab countries are looking for. Now, what is the role of Iran? Quite clearly, Iran did have a hand in organizing the attack. Russia and China probably helped in the background in orchestrating things. The question really is, will America / Israel attack Iran? I think that the first stage is Damascus. There will then be intense back-channel negotiations going on between the different parties to see if some form of settlement to stop the war going any further will take place. Our bet is 40–60% chance that an attack will be made next year, not this year, on Iran. What we know from local sources is that Iran has made preparations for some time for an attack. The shoreline is lined with Chinese and Russian latest anti-ship missiles. So if the Seventh Fleet gets anywhere in range of those missiles, they will receive serious damage. Iran has also organized how they will block the narrow part of the Straits of Hormuz. A local friend of mine actually took his boat out a few months ago and found out which two supertankers Iran would use to block the channel. So basically, Iran is prepared for an attack. You might say that if an attack occurred and Iran bested America and Israel, which a number of local people think will be the case, then you could say, then what are the implications? The huge global derivative market would implode. Oil would be whatever number you care to name, certainly well over 150. G7 countries would be in total mayhem. And you could then say, maybe that's game, set, and match for BRICS. Because in that turmoil, they could lay out whatever new system that they're working on at the moment. But that all depends on if an attack takes place. So I'm not saying it will, but it is a risk that actually we've been pointing towards for about 2 years. It's just got that much closer. Where will this all end? My take is that it would always take a catastrophe to bring countries together, including Israel. many of the GCC member countries currently dislike the policy that Iran has been following in Lebanon and in Iraq. In the negotiations that are bound to take place, Iran, and now that Iran becomes a member of BRICS on the 1st of January, its domestic policies are going to have to start being more cosmopolitan, just as 6 years ago, Saudi Arabia began that process, and look where they are today. For Iran, it may take a similar profile step by step, but it also may involve a domestic revolution. Certainly, friends of ours in Iran with close ties to the government have actually become very optimistic about the economy. A few months ago, I sent an SMS to a friend of ours there who actually runs the largest wire and cable company. And I said, my gut instinct is that your economy is about to take off and thus copper consumption to grow sharply. His reply was very short. Correct, I've just bought an Iranian copper mine. So I think catastrophe could lead to the various parties finding ways to come together. I think that it means that diplomacy is started again, that America, Israel, and many other countries have forgotten how to use diplomacy to solve problems.
Simon, where are the statesmen, stateswomen today?
That's a very good question. Actually, in this part of the world, I think that MBS is a statesman. I think the leadership in the UAE are statesmen. I'm having a hard time trying to find statesmen in G7 countries. So maybe the G7 needs its own catastrophe before statespeople can emerge. And maybe in America, that's Bobby Kennedy.
Now, to take a look at markets, you gave us an indication of what can happen to oil. Have you revised your comment on copper?
Let me say, I think that, first of all, on oil and other markets too, I think what's happened in Israel was only a temporary blip up in oil prices and other markets. I think that over the next few weeks, the trends that were emerging will continue. So therefore, we've got oil in the first quarter of next year down to $70 and perhaps $50. No change in our copper forecasts, which means that by the end of the first quarter, we will see prices between 6,000 and 6,500. But that does not mean we don't see short-term sharp rallies. Why do we think that? First of all, physical consumption is extremely weak around the world. China, from my best friends there, refined copper consumption will at best be flat and more likely down 1 to 2%. In Europe, in the first half of this year, refined consumption was basically unchanged on last year. But since then, there's been a dramatic fall off in physical business, anything from 20 to 40%. That, from talking to people, no bottoming out yet. And I don't think you'll see that until the first quarter of next year. And in America, all that I can say is consumption is lower than last year. Around mid-year, the big fabricators cancelled physical business and rescheduled deliveries so that now they've got balanced books, but they have no interest in buying physical metal for the rest of this year.
Now, that has been your opinion. That's pretty consistent. But is this a watershed moment? Because I hate to say it, but in one sense, they're talking about World War III. And then earlier, you sort of alluded to the fact that we have a long shot chance of actually coming out of this crisis with a reorder in the world that makes more sense.
First of all, we need to see the fall in prices first. And then what we see happening is that by the end of the first quarter, with wars intensifying, don't forget Ukraine, where I think the war is going to be focusing on attacking Russia itself, Crimea, and the Baltic Fleet. Add those together, there's going to be very nervous markets all over the place. Combined with we have America in recession, as some well-known people are now saying we are now in recession, but America will be in recession by the end of this year. Plus Europe remains in recession, plus China going nowhere. The Fed will be forced, if against its best wishes, to revert policy back to dropping rates and to flooding the system with credit full on. That then leads us into the second half of the year, the start of a highly inflationary environment, added to which you'll see oil prices well over 150 without a war, without Iran being attacked, and food prices soaring because of weather conditions and the onset at the end of this year or early next year of the 89-year Glesberg cycle, which caused in the Midwest the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the Midwest. So we have global inflation 13, 15%. What does that mean for long-term interest rates? We have 10-year treasuries by early 2025, if not before, yielding over 10%. What does that do? Kills off a highly leveraged global system, which leads us into 7 years of rolling recessions, if not depression.
Well, Simon, let's bring on the hounds now, because they, I'm sure, have questions. And if you can stay with us for a bit.
I think I mentioned earlier there was a video of an American intelligence officer from the Marines. And what he said is that last year, Israel ran some war games and even attacking Hezbollah or even Syria or Damascus, as you mentioned, they don't come out well. they lose. And Netanyahu is very aware of that. And I've just noticed that they've formed an all-party war committee now in Israel. America just doesn't have the capability of stretching itself into the Middle East right now. It's, you know, the days of, as this guy said, 750,000 soldiers coming into the Middle East, those days are over. What do you think? And why Damascus?
Why Damascus? Because the thinking, right or wrong, by the intelligence services in America is that we extend the war zone with Russia from the Ukraine to the Middle East. And by so doing, we open a new front which would force Russia to deplete some of its forces and equipment from the Ukraine. That's the thinking, rightly or wrongly.
Right.
But what's happening on the northern front now? And so far as the simulated games that have been played, that wouldn't surprise me at all. But you've got the element of hubris in. The generals still think they control the world.
Are you referring to Israeli generals?
No, American generals.
One of the other points that was made is that a lot of the artillery and ammunition that the Americans have been sending to Ukraine has been stolen and rerouted down to Hezbollah. So the Russians had to go around looking for ammunition, didn't they, and for help?
Certainly what I hear out of Russia, I mean, all those factories are running 24/7, and there is no shortage of ammunition, despite what you hear in the Western media.
Okay. And then when you take into consideration Larry's brilliant video yesterday, highlighting that the Americans are likely to increase or almost double their defense spend, that takes up copper, it takes all sorts of things.
Yeah, but we first got to have the correction before we go into the bull market. And how long does that bull market last? Are we going to have the serious recession as we've got in our scenario? If you do, well, you can double the defense spending, but you've got to take it out from somewhere.
Exactly. No, exactly. I agree with you on that point, Simon. But at the moment, there's no G7 country, and including the United States at the moment, public spending, it's what's keeping their head above water. That's the only thing that's stopping a full-scale recession from coming in. In other words, the private sector.
Yeah, the problem is what happens when by early 2025, you've got inflation roaring and you've got 10-year treasuries yielding over 10%.
10-year treasuries at 10%, in my mind, blows up everything.
Exactly.
Eddie.
Yeah, Simon, I appreciate your political opinion. I disagree with you on Robert F. Kennedy, but I want to ask you about American statesmen. And Larry Jetalo, I'd also like to hear from on this. We won't get into any kind of a discussion about the two clowns, and I'll name the two clowns, Biden and Trump. Forget those two guys. There's one guy out there for whom I have a lot of respect who seems to know the world and the Middle East, and that's a guy called Mike Pompeo. Do you follow the U.S. politicians to any degree? And do you share my view that this guy could step out of the shadows, despite having said he doesn't want to run, because he is such a good global thinker and has had such tremendous experience?
I'm going to refrain from commenting.
Okay, well, that's fair. Maybe Larry Jetalo has a view because he's a good political observer.
Eddie, I was with Mike Pompeo last Thursday.
Good.
No way he's running. I'm not kidding. And that's one of the questions that came up, and he is not interested.
Well, he wasn't interested, and I'll tell you what my theory was. I think when he said he wasn't interested, he concluded that the Democrats were going to win, and why go into a losing fight And maybe it would make more sense because he's quite young that he could come back in 4 years when things are a bigger mess and have a better chance of winning. That was just my own theory based on nothing other than an attempt to think ahead. So you may be quite right, but the world has changed and the Middle East has changed it. And he's about the only guy in the United States that I see that has any brains about the Middle East. I mean, Blinken, as you saw, got up the other day and said publicly, I think on Sunday morning, that there was no evidence that Iran was involved. And here's the Secretary of State just coming out with complete and utter bullshit.
I'm going to tell you something, okay? A lot of the people on this call are very North American centric, and I don't know if Simon will agree with me on this or not. However, there is a humbling of America that is being imposed. And we heard so often that the dollar is backed by American military might. Well, the whole world right now is going to see if that might is actually there. I don't know if you agree, Simon.
I agree entirely. You can see it in what's been happening in Ukraine.
Excellent. Now let's get Larry Gettolo in here.
This is Simon's show. I don't want to say too much. Maybe just a couple of quick comments. I agree with you, Eddie, that I think Pompeo would make a good president, but I also agree with Denise. He's not going to run. From what I understand, he's too smart to run in this right now. As far as RFK is concerned, I watched him last night for about 5 minutes in an interview, which Fox really wouldn't let him talk. But the point they were making was that when you ask him about his policy on fracking, which he's been blunt about, and that is he wants to end it completely in order to solve the worldwide plastics crisis. I mean, you want to get to $150 oil? That's how to do it. And he was basically denying that he had ever said that. Well, he had said it. It's in public. You know, that's what's amazing about these guys is they act like there's no such thing as video or YouTube or the internet. And anyway, so as far as the U.S. military goes, I think the world is going to find out here that they have a lot more reach, a lot more capability, and they still have the money to prosecute a war of the kind that we're talking about here. And I don't think we need large-scale land forces. That's not where it's going to be fought out. This is going to be the first World War. I guess it's sort of like World War II was. We weren't charging horses into trenches anymore. This one's going to be different. And I think the outcome is going to be, it's partly economic. I think it's great to have Simon on because this is where the war is going to be won or lost, I think, is in who can outlast everybody else financially. And we'll never see 10% rates. The Treasury will stop rates. They'll peg them just like they did during the Korean War. But to do that, then they have to print money. And the inflation that was produced in the late 40s, early 50s is going to look like a picnic compared to what we're going to have down the road a bit if that's how it comes out. So I'll just stop there and go back to Simon. Simon, when are you going to leave Dubai and go somewhere safe?
Oh, I'm going to be safe here. Thank you.
Okay, good. Glad to hear it.
Simon, can I ask a question? What are your thoughts on Egypt getting involved here?
I think we just have to wait and see how the chips fall. Too early to make any sensible comment.
But first, Simon, what about Lebanon?
Lebanon is going to be involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Lebanon is Hezbollah. I mean, and that's the real problem here, which is Hamas is, of an order kind of like a biker gang. Hezbollah is a very organized, disciplined military faction with backing by Iran. I think one of the problems we're dealing with is lack of time. At the moment, as I understand it, Israel is sitting there calculating and looking at the probabilities of whether they can locate and successfully rescue any of the hostages, which would be viewed as a humanitarian mission. Failing that, I don't expect them to negotiate. I expect them to kind of take a leaf out of Tacitus, and it's going to be they make a desert and call it peace. If you go back some years, Tom Friedman once said that the problem with Gaza is nobody really wanted it. The Egyptians didn't want it because of the nature of the Gazans. The Israelis didn't want it because of the nature of the Gazans. So you've got Gaza and situation with a populace that basically shoots itself in the foot most of the time. I think the other issue in terms of reality is, regardless of the reach of our forces, there is a clear shortage of munitions, particularly artillery shells, and the ramping up of what is needed to prosecute a war with artillery, which is a major consumer of munitions, by predictions in the U.S. defense industry, is not going to happen until 2025, when we start producing shells at a rate sufficient to fight a war. And I think one of the problems we have had with Ukraine is we had pre-positioned supplies of American munitions sitting in stockpiles in Israel, and they have been pulled out of Israel to give to Ukraine. So you've got a problem here going forward. And unfortunately, if you look back to the Yom Kippur War, Israel was very close to being on the edge of using nuclear weapons to save the state. And I think the danger we face here, and this is very much like World War I and Barbara Tuchman, where things just keep spiraling out of control, is you may find a necessity to save the existence of the state of Israel, where they consider and may actually have to use tactical and strategic nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Dimitri.
Thanks. Simon, I was wondering what you make about this. So we've heard people like Jake Sullivan just the other week talking about how Middle East has been the quietest, most peaceful place in nearly 20 years. And so you were mentioning, kind of speculating on who could be behind it. You mentioned that the U.S. intelligence community could be behind some of what we're seeing right now in Israel. Do you think that the Biden administration and the intelligence community are not on the same page, as in they're doing it independently? And especially given the elections upcoming next year, what do you think is Biden's administration position? Because I don't see them looking at it and seeing the expansion of the conflict as beneficial for their campaign.
I think the short answer is there's one political side and there's another political side. And I think it's the neocons who are driving policy. So we have to see how it turns out.
So essentially, you think Biden administration and the intelligence community are on different pages on this issue right now?
I'm not sure. I don't know, so I can't answer that question directly. All I do know is that there was an American intelligence footprint in all of this.
I'll venture an answer on that one. Everything I have learned about the biopharmaceutical complex suggests to me that every president is de facto, the deep state runs everything. They regard the elected officials as just mere passers-by, and they go ahead and do what they want to do.
I agree with you.
And if they do it, and often they will do it in the name of defense. And defense supersedes everything. They get all kinds of authority as a result of acting in the defensive mode. So, national defense. Yeah.
No argument with that.
Donovan, may I ask you another question? I've been watching, as everybody else has. There's been tremendous amount of stations pop up on YouTube, and I spent most of last night watching them, and I get different points of view. If, as and when this thing escalates, which of the Middle East countries is the biggest winner? Forgetting about Iran for the moment. Where, for example, does MLB stand in terms of this? And I happen to think you're right, that he is the strongest guy over there. Is he the big winner because he gets to kind of calm the waters or participate in some way that'll be to his benefit?
I think you include UAE into that.
Okay. So they're the two winners.
They're the two big winners, yes.
Okay. Good answer. I hadn't thought about the UAE because it doesn't have the same profile as MLB. who has been throwing his weight around quite successfully since he ascended to, if you will, to the power.
Simon, India hasn't been mentioned. Any thoughts?
Yes, there's absolutely no question that India will replace China as the dominant growing economic force. Look at the demographics, look at the way that they have got the villages behind them through their technology. India is the winner.
Mitchell, we see you there. Any comment?
I don't know. I'm just thinking if these diplomats arise and peace breaks out, the US economy is toast. They need wars to keep it going. Simon, you haven't directly mentioned gold in all of this. I'm sure you have an opinion, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think the simple answer is on any dip you buy gold. Gold is coming back into the monetary system. Look what China's done with opening up the gold market even more to the common garden household.
Ed?
I think to some extent we're assuming none of this migrates to North America. If you paid any attention over the weekend, there were spontaneous demonstrations, totally unconnected, of course, that broke out in major cities as well on major university campuses in the United States in support of Palestine and the actions of Hamas. A friend of mine who's involved with the FBI has said one of the unfortunate issues we have at the moment is 90% of the FBI agents have been focused on domestic terrorism in the US as opposed to jihadist and international terrorism. And for years, there has been a concern about people coming up through an unguarded border. For the longest time, there was a concern that from Venezuela, you were going to get Spanish-speaking jihadists who had lived in Venezuela for a while and looked like Venezuelans. And of course, nobody could tell the difference. And we have the problem of not having a Venezuelan community of any size in the US, so they can't be identified. So I think to some extent to make the assumption that the kind of extremism and terrorism you have seen happen in Israel cannot happen in Canada or the US is a little naive at the moment.
Yeah, Ed, you're quite right. There was a demonstration in Toronto pro-Palestine.
Well, what's interesting in the UK, the government is banning any Palestine flags to be flown.
Steve?
Simon, you're in Dubai. What do you feel the support that exists within, I'm going to say, today's UAE, Qatar, Saudis, Iraq, towards the crisis that we see now taking place? Is there support for the Palestinians, or is there a reality that there's been barbaric acts that have taken place?
I think there is a popular support for the Palestinians, but the government treads a very careful line because of the trade relations with the government of Israel. So what they say is going to be very nuanced, but the general feeling in the UAE is certainly pro-Palestine. And I think that even if there is no negotiated settlement, I think the trade relations will continue between the UAE and Israel, but through the back channels. For instance, it's Israeli watering technology that is being used in the UAE. So we have green pastures all over the place, trees growing that wouldn't normally grow in a desert. It's a very green city.
Simon, the one country you have not mentioned at all is Jordan, and the responsibility, of course, of the Hashemite kingdom for guarding the holy places in Jerusalem. And we have heard nothing out of the king of Jordan or the Jordanians.
They're in an extremely difficult position. I don't know the answer to your statement, except that we had the US Army Airborne Division that's now in Romania flying to Jordan.
Well, and of course, they at one point had to deal with the expulsion themselves of Black September and the Palestinians. So they're kind of conflicted there.
Absolutely.
And Simon, any concerns that China may take advantage of this additional disruption
In what way?
to maybe put a little more pressure on Taiwan?
That's a very interesting question and a very difficult one to answer. But my bottom line is that China does not want to attack. There are red lines that they have drawn with America, and if America crosses those red lines, then they'll be forced to. The two red lines that immediately come to mind: number one, America officially supports an independent Taiwan. And the second is if America places weaponry in Taiwan that is offensive for China, then China will move. Problem on that one is they are starting to upgrade what they sell to Taiwan.
Simon, if they sit back, will the Chinese just win it in a Taiwanese election someday?
I'm not so sure about that. I thought so a few months ago, but looking at the recent polls, it's by no means clear.
Okay, on that note, we're going to bid you adieu, and I've taken you well over the half hour that I promised, so my promises aren't worth a damn. Have a good sleep.
No, I'd have a good drink first.
Okay, have a good drink, great. And play good tennis tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay,
Hope
take
so.
care. Thank you.
Bye.